We are live. Okay, welcome everyone to this month's live stream. We have the amazing Dr. Nick Estes with us. For anyone who doesn't know who Nick Estes is, he's an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. He's a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, and he's a co-founder of the Red Nation, which is an organization dedicated to the liberation of Native peoples from capitalism and colonialism. He's the host of the Red Nation podcast, which is a really awesome podcast that everyone should check out. He's also the author of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the long history of Indigenous resistance. So thank you so much, Nick, for coming on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mexie.
Awesome. Okay, I'm really stoked to have this conversation. I was just saying before that I have a number of questions. I always come up with a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask these first, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions from the chat at the end. And if anyone has a question related to something that we're talking about, then I'll just bring it up at the time. So I thought we could start with US election stuff. Like, you almost don't want to talk about it, but unfortunately the US election takes up the entire world's airwaves for years at a time. Yeah. So I thought we could start talking about that in relation to US empire and then move into decolonization and land back stuff. So the election, Joe Biden. I guess I'll preface this by saying that in the run up to the election, I tried not to comment on it too much because I'm from Canada. I'm not from the US. And so if I was criticizing Biden or something, people would really take that as like someone who doesn't even live here condemning us to fascism or something like that. So I kind of just sat back and, took in how people were approaching it. And I think a lot of leftists were approaching it like, voting for Biden is strategic. It's somehow, some harm reduction or something like that. But I did see a lot of people vote shaming like BIPOC comrades who, for very good reasons, did not want to engage or vote in this election. So I guess I'm just wondering how you, as an Indigenous activist who cares about decolonization, how did you approach this election and either engage or disengage? What did it mean to you?
Yeah, I guess the simple answer to that, well, first of all, I was going to ask you if you're Canadian.
Yeah.
You said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Oh. That broadcast, that giveaway. But no, I think the short answer to that question is, I'm part of a union, the American Federation of Teachers, also United Academics here at UNM, and our union does a lot of voting, like promoting elections and things like that, and they side with certain candidates. So I tend to align with my union, especially in local elections, because it does affect education. So I would say my approach to it is more from initially from a strategic point of view, is from a point of view of organized labor, and then from a point a larger kind of political context. And I agree with you in the sense that there is this kind of hypersensitivity around the electoral process in the United States, but that's not what democracy is. Mm-hmm. And there's often a confusion of voting or elections with the actual, democratic process. And we actually did an episode on this for the Red Nation podcast with the historian Roxanne Delvar-Ortiz, where we talked about this in the kind of cult-like following around the U.S. Constitution, especially as it relates to, the creation of the federal system and how Indigenous peoples fit within that. And oftentimes, I think for very good reason, we talk about the U.S. Constitution and the electoral process in terms of the Black vote, because that's really where or how the electoral process was actually created, was to actually marginalize and create minorities out of Black people themselves. And that's when you have people who, you have the 3/5 compromise, you have the creation of the Electoral College, which guaranteed kind of like a majority of a minority, meaning that the southern states would always have kind of a majority voice or an overrepresentation within the kind of political process, because they would have equal amount of senators as well as equal amount of or overrepresentation of electoral votes. So to make it's like really kind of getting into the weeds of things, but to make a long story short, is like we don't live in a democracy. We don't directly elect a president, first and foremost. And I think it's okay. It's not a radical thing to say, because as we can see right now, even with the results of the presidential election, there's a refusal on the part of Republicans to actually accept the election results. So they're cynical about their own, quote unquote, democratic processes. But for Indigenous people, this raises a series of larger questions, and this is something that we approached in that podcast, and it's something that I think we should be thinking about, not just as Indigenous people. We're not just some kind of like special interest that shows up every 4 years to vote for this or that candidate. But there is, we represent kind of a political bloc, and there's a reason why yesterday during the MAGA rallies, during the Make America Great Again rallies for Trump in DC, you saw a sign that said, what did it say? First we go after the blacks and the Indians, and it was like a very explicit, thing, because Indigenous people, there's an acknowledgement that Indigenous people, not through the electoral process, but through the federal system, and just by the mere fact we control large amounts of land, we have a lot of political power in this country, but we've been effectively made within the electoral process, and even within the kind of constitutional process, a minority, like an ineffective minority, to the point where, at least the right wing acknowledges our power and the actual threat we pose to their political project. But on the other hand, you have like liberal CNN saying that, we're something else in the category of voters, like literally, quote unquote, something else.
What?
Oh, you didn't see this?
No.
Oh my God. It's like for like a hot minute. Well, actually, like it literally became played out in Indian country like within the matter of an hour, because there were so many memes created about it. But there was some CNN pollster who was like, they did some kind of exit poll, and they were like, these are the categories of people who voted today. There was like whites, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, and then the bottom was a small thing that said something else.
Oh God.
So yeah, there was a lot of joking about it, and I think for a lot of us on the left, there's this kind of, like you said, there was a lot of shaming amongst Indigenous people to get out to vote. And it's not to minimize the impact that Native voters had, and I can talk a little bit about that, because I do think that they contributed to flipping states like Arizona.
For sure.
But there was an emphasis, like, coming from people like Deb Haaland and others, that, voting is sacred, and that it's our obligation as Native people to vote in this election. And that was very much a liberal narrative, but like the liberal mainstream like didn't even recognize us. We did, and somebody was like, "So we did all this voting as sacred stuff, and then we get categorized."
Yeah.
So
I know, that's terrible. And you're right. Yeah, I mean, the Navajo Nation was pivotal in flipping Arizona, right? But yeah, I mean, and I just saw this on the left, like people who are anti-capitalist, just not really understanding why, some Indigenous people might not want to legitimize the US empire through voting, right? And then kind of putting it all on BIPOC people, even though, BIPOC people are the ones who really make or break elections for the Democrats anyway, and they did come out for Biden, right? So it's just, I don't know, a very strange landscape right now.
Yeah, I would like, I know that people are like, oh, they came out and voted for Biden. But I would make a different argument and say, like, I think they
voted against
Trump.
Yeah.
More than anything.
That's true. Yeah. But yeah. So yeah, that kind of feeds into my second question about, what does the US empire look like under a Biden versus a Trump? And maybe just high level, what does the US empire look like between Democratic and Republican establishments in general? And what change, or do you think there might be any change that will be felt by Indigenous people or colonized people here and abroad?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know if I really believe in the argument that the Democratic Party can be pushed to make, certain concessions to the left. I would, somebody who's been an anti-war organizer, for since the beginning, since the start of the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. Somebody, I was in high school at that time, and that's really when I began to get politicized. It had a certain investment within, presidential politics, especially with somebody like, Obama. At the time, I was a little bit like, I was a little bit disenchanted with the Democratic Party on a whole, but like still nonetheless held out some kind of belief or hope that, Obama ran on closing Guantanamo Bay. And I was like, this is a good sign, because he's going to start dismantling this, security apparatus that was created under the Bush administration and the expansion of the global war on terror. But as we saw through 8 years of his presidency, he didn't do anything along those lines, and in fact expanded the Bush doctrine to something we could call the Obama doctrine. He actually increased drone warfare, something that his predecessor Trump ended up doing. And so what I see the current Biden administration doing is actually, I don't think they're interested in Trumpism so much. I think right now the political landscape is Trumpism versus everything else.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's done this really bizarre marriage of Obama and it's not so bizarre, but it's a marriage of Obama era like policies and administrators and officials with the Bush era, right? That's a lot of the people he brought, the never Trumpers that he brought onto his campaign. So I don't see that as a real alternative. And in fact, I think, whether one believes in these things or not, like if you're a follower of like the Democratic Socialist wing of the Democratic Party, they were more successful in their election campaigns when they ran candidates who ran on things like defund the police, and Medicare, and specifically Medicare for all, because that's an affirmative policy that like I think everyone can get behind. But all of the kind of cynical corporate Democrats, largely like they didn't have that same kind of election record. They didn't have that same kind of success. I think there's something to that, and where like indigenous people fall within that line is that, we had a really good conversation with a journalist friend of mine recently who covers tribal affairs for the New Republic, Nick Martin, and we talked about how, the primary way that indigenous people are racialized in this country is through disappearance and erasure. We are not supposed to be here. I think there was a study that said less than 25% of Americans acknowledge that they've met a real indigenous or had a conversation with a real indigenous person. And so when you're under the terms of constant erasure, that lure of like representational politics, whether it's on, in the Democratic Party or in the Republican Party, is very strong, because we simply don't have any kind of mechanism within this current system to actually leverage indigenous rights or indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, so I would say, you're completely right in terms of Obama and the administration, and people kind of forget that Biden was part of that, So yeah, I don't think Biden is particularly good on foreign policy. And then I guess, could you speak a bit to Biden or Obama's role in like the violence that was enacted towards water protectors at Standing Rock? Because
yeah, I mean, I think I didn't answer the other part of your question, is about like how
right.
Biden would be on foreign policy, and I actually don't think he would be. I think it would be a different flavor of what Trump is doing. I would think it would be a continuation of the Obama era, and we had an actual coup attempt, several coup attempts in Venezuela under Trump, but we also had a successful coup attempt, or a successful coup in Bolivia. But if we go to the Obama years, you can point to like Honduras and the entering into the Syrian civil war and all these other kind of examples of, it was a total interventionist policy on behalf of the Obama administration. And I think it's a weird moment because, 4 years ago, Standing Rock was popping off because after the elections on November 8th, there was this large disenchantment with, across the left. In general, there's this kind of sense of dread, the kind of waning of the Obama administration and the entry into this kind of Trump era. And you have to remember that, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually announced her successful bid for Congress while she was at Standing Rock, because she saw she saw a lot of no alternative, and it was the only sustained protest movement that was going on at the time. So I remember around Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving, when I showed up the last time, for my last time that I was there, there was just a stream of cars coming into camp, because it was everyone kind of put a lot of hope in that. I would say the impetus for things like the Green New Deal came out of that political alternative that was offered at Standing Rock. And the failure of the Obama administration, I think, is very apparent in the sense that Obama he only acknowledged it once publicly, to my knowledge, that this was happening at Standing Rock, and he said, we'll look into it. And at that moment in time, it was one of the largest police mobilizations, right? You have to remember, this is a rural geography. There was deployed over 90 different law enforcement jurisdictions, including federal jurisdictions such as Customs and Border Patrol, Homeland Security. I don't know if ICE was there, but I know some of their equipment was used in that, as well as Hennepin County Sheriff's Department, which is the county where George Floyd was actually murdered by police. And also Montana Highway Patrol, who actually later went on to go around the country to teach law enforcement jurisdictions how to put down rural uprisings, specifically on Indian reservation land.
Wow.
And Obama never really acknowledged it. I don't know. I'm actually going to read his. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but I do want to read his new memoir to see because he has to acknowledge it, because David Archambault's sister, the president or the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, was she was an Obama appointee in his administration, and Obama actually visited the Standing Rock Sioux tribe back in 2014. So there was a direct connection between Standing Rock and the Obama administration, and so he had to have known. But even in the years where he reflected back on his administration, he talked about being politicized by the civil rights movement and seeing the images of Black civil rights organizers and people part of the Black freedom struggle getting sprayed by fire hoses and attacked by attack dogs. But not once did he mention the fact that actually happened under his administration.
No, I am really curious to see if what he'll say about that. I guess one of my worries, I don't know if you share this, is that under Obama, when the Democrats are in power, obviously people think that there's kind of, that things are better or they're fine. Like Biden's running on this quote unquote return to normalcy. And I worry that, under Trump, people who probably wouldn't have cared so much about a coup in Venezuela or a coup in Bolivia, I feel we're just really everything Trump did was bad. So it was a lot easier to get, average libs or whatever to be yeah, this is bad. This is regime change. We don't like this. And I guess I worry that, similarly, under Obama, I feel even though Standing Rock, and Ferguson, that happened under Obama, it doesn't really stick to him the same way that it does to Trump. People kind of think oh, well, I'm sure he wanted to do something, but his hands were tied or something. Whereas under Trump, it's no, it's all Trump's fault. He's horrible. This is a horrible administration. So I guess I worry with Biden that we're heading back into this, phase where people will see things the coup in Venezuela, and it'll be more kind of maturity politics, oh, well, of course we have to do this to help the people, or we have to, it'll be more respectable. Whereas under Trump, it won't be. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's important. I talk about this in my book, and I've talked about it since the Trump election, that domestic oil and gas production in the United States actually increased 88% under Obama, because of his, and not necessarily because of his policies. I mean, there was the fracking revolution, and the advent of certain kinds of technology that made fracking for a short period of time profitable. Now we're seeing that it's not profitable, and so Biden has hitched his wagon to a dead horse. That's not a good analogy. His wagon to a sinking ship. That's a really awful analogy. But
Yeah.
but I think one of the elements that sticks out to me about that time period was in a Democracy Now! Interview. Winona LaDuke was literally walking to the front lines in Standing Rock in 2016. And I don't know if it was Amy Goodman or somebody was interviewing her as as she was doing her thing.
Mhm.
And they're what do you see this as? And she's like, this is an escalation of aggression against Venezuela. And they're like, wait, what? How's that connection being made? And what she said is that Venezuela has the largest known oil reserves in the entire world, and the development and the exploitation of natural or oil in the United States as a domestic kind of economic development program is directly related to the sanctions campaign that Obama implemented. And he tightened the screws on Venezuela, and you can read the WikiLeaks cables to see this kind of this kind of escalation and aggression that he was pushing against Chavez, and then later Maduro. But it was a way to implement sanctions against Venezuela, and to wean the United States off of Venezuelan produced oil. And so Obama's energy policy was towards American energy independence, right? It was by any means necessary, in the sense that it would develop the most exploitative forms of oil and gas drilling, such as fracking, while also exploring green technologies. And I think it's fascinating. I'm interested to see. I don't know where Biden actually falls on this. I've looked and looked, and I think there's a reason why we don't know the answer to this. But he's come out in opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, which, by the way, is really funny, because Trudeau, when he met the president-elect Biden, when he had a meeting with him, his only topic of conversation was try to get Biden to reverse his decision on canceling the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline.
Good. Yes. Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So liberalism.
Liberalism.
My what I'm really interested in is he hasn't said anything publicly about the Dakota Access pipeline. I wonder why that is. I wonder if his energy policy is going to be the same as Obama's, in the sense that Obama, the reason why he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline permit is because it crossed the international border, and it didn't fall within his American energy independence thing, because he was interested in developing only the kind of domestic capacity, whereas Trump is he doesn't care where it's coming from. He went from energy independence to unleashing American energy dominance, is the term that he uses on the globe. So it'll be interesting to see where Biden falls on this, because the oil going through the Dakota Access pipeline is primarily fracked, and he's refused to come out in opposition to fracking. So who knows?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think he's gonna definitely have to be pushed really far on that. But yeah, it is kind of the same in Canada, that all these pipelines are kind of touted under the banner of oh, well, we need to develop Canadian oil, which is the dirtiest oil. Actually, the tar sands is even worse than fracking. But yeah, so we need to just run roughshod over Indigenous rights in order to have quote unquote energy independence. But we're not even really developing green energy. So,
well, the argument that Trudeau makes is he's we have to develop the dirty stuff to get the clean stuff.
Yeah, right. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. And yeah, liberalism. So I wanted to move to the Supreme Court. So Abby Martin from the Empire Files made a video about why we should abolish the Supreme Court because it's undemocratic and kind of all the rest. But she was focusing on Roe v. Wade and the fact that the Supreme Court can overturn the election results. But I wanted to hear your take on that. I know that you've talked about the Marshall decision and how really devastating that's been for upholding the treaties. But and then there are some good cases like the Oklahoma decision, where a large part of Oklahoma was actually Muskogee Creek Reservation, but that didn't actually give the land back. It was just about criminal investigations. So yeah, thoughts on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, the Supreme Court is a really undemocratic institution, and I agree with Abby Martin. It should be abolished. I think for Indigenous people, I think it was under John Marshall, the Supreme Court justice, who actually expanded the powers of the Supreme Court to have to wield the kind of influence it does today, beyond its original constitutional mandate, because it kind of existed in this. I'm not like trying to uphold the Constitution as like the model, document, but he took lots of liberties with the Supreme Court in the expansion and in the interpretation of the Constitution. And that's the kind of effect that we're dealing with today. And there's, it's no accident that he was the one who decided these three monumental court decisions that still affect Indigenous people, known as, the Marshall Trilogy, like categorically defining not only the Cherokee Nation as a domestic dependent nation, but all potential or all future Indigenous people who would enter into relation with the U.S. And sort of pulling them into that kind of like domestication process with the courts. Mm-hmm. And it really, there's debates about it within Indigenous communities about the best process and the best approach to the Supreme Court. But, the truth of the matter is that you get somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who may be good on some issues, but historically her record has been really bad on Indigenous issues and actually upholding the racist legal doctrines that John Marshall upheld. And the McGirt decision, actually, I wouldn't categorize it as a good decision so much as like they were just upholding the law that they wrote, and it's like asking like mediocre white guys to be like, don't be racist and don't be a dick, and like you shouldn't get a cookie for that. And so like Gorsuch was this conservative Supreme Court judge. And he wrote he wrote it's actually a pretty eloquent decision. I mean, it's he's like on the other side of the Trail of Tears was a promise. It's like, wow, it's he's very poetic in his writing, but I think at the end of the day, it's like if Oklahoma had been following the law the entire time with these treaties, which are federal law and they're not state law, then we would be in this predicament in the first place. And it's fascinating to me that the kind of liberal left judicial process has ceded that ground to interpretation of the textualists, the Anthony Scalia school of Supreme Court justices. Yeah. And I don't know, I think the only remedy to that particular situation, like with a short-term remedy, is to create there has to be some kind of act of Congress that moves those decisions out of this judicial body and into a different kind of, a new era of Indian affairs, because right now we're Indian affairs. They say we're in the era of self-determination where we get to decide, but it's really the era of it's the era of consultation where they just consult us as they take our lands and as they make decisions about what they want to do with those lands. So we are not even living in, some people call it moving into the era of consent. And I would say it needs to be something a little bit more robust than that.
Yeah, it's fairly similar in Canada about like the consultation process being really terrible. And in Canada, the Supreme Court has very often actually upheld Indigenous rights and title, but then it doesn't actually translate into action on the ground. And I think there's a similar thing where the treaties are with the Crown and the federal government, but then the provinces just issue tenures and just disrespect treaty rights. but it sounds like in the States, actually, like with that Marshall decision and the rest, it sounds like actually they're watering down, like in Canada, they definitely don't like respect the treaties at all. But I think there is kind of this growing movement to make people really respect and uphold them. And that has so much power because obviously Indigenous nations can, like out of everyone, they can really question the authority of the settler state itself, and then of like the capitalist projects and whatnot. But yeah, it sounds like they're really trying to, I guess, take the teeth out of the political power that you would otherwise have, particularly under like UNDRIP and stuff. But I doubt that the U.S. is a signatory to that.
Yeah, they are, but it's
they are?
There's actually Obama, like he was the one who signed, but it was like emphasizing the non-binding element of to say like we're not bound to uphold everything. So
right. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to move on to decolonization and land back, but people are saying that there's like horrible people in the chat. I do have mods, so mods, can you kick these people out if they're horrid? Yeah, thank you. Or maybe I'll just add more mods. But yeah, let me know. Oh, Catherine, you're a mod. Definitely kick anyone out who's being horrible. Apparently there's like Nazi people in the chat. So get those people out. Okay. So moving on to like decolonization and the land back movement. So on the ground, like in Toronto, the work that's happening on the ground, I feel like the majority of radical movements are led by Indigenous and BIPOC comrades, and there isn't a lot of debate. Like everyone's really on board with land back and decolonization and things like that. But with the work I do online, I find it actually really, really difficult to talk to other settler leftists about decolonization or land back and things like that. People are, I guess, frightened of it. They don't know what it is, or they just get really upset by it. And there's kind of this general discourse that we can actually decouple or just separate the anti-capitalist struggle from the decolonial one. So I was hoping you could maybe speak to that and how these struggles are actually woven together.
Yeah, it's kind of a yellow, or I don't know what they say, red herring. I was gonna say yellow herring. I don't even know what a herring is. I think it's a fish.
I think it's a fish.
All these animal metaphors. I think I got nervous because I saw you're a vegan and I was like, oh no, I don't want to.
No, don't even worry about it.
But I'm just really bad at metaphors and I have dad humor. Yeah. So, but I think the accusation that gets leveled at Indigenous people tends to be like, oh, well, they just want to create an ethno-state, or, what are you going to do with all the people who live on the land and blah, 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 blah. And those accusations assume a lot of stuff, which I think is really like, it says more about these kind of like repressed fears than it does about like anything Indigenous people represent or like the land back or decolonization represents. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I would say is that we already live in an ethno-state. Just read the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution as it was written in 1887. Read the Federalist Papers. It was very much intended to always be an ethno-state, and that's why we're in the predicament that we are. Mm-hmm. And secondly, there isn't, they didn't just hate Indigenous people because like they hated our culture or spirituality or whatever. They hated us for two primary reasons. One, we were atop land that they wanted. Mm-hmm. And two, we actually represented an alternative political order to these settler states. Mm-hmm. For the first point, is important because there's this idea in going back to these federal case laws and federal law in general as it relates to Indigenous people, there's a recursive element, and this is kind of like a fancy term, but basically it assumes that Indigenous people were owners of the land for it to be taken and transferred into the possession of others, when in fact land tenure as we know it today is something that is primarily, it's not only about European kind of like nation states, but the land tenure system that we have inherited or that was been forced upon us in this land does derive from a European like tradition of conquest. Mm-hmm. But also this idea of ownership is based on exclusion and the right to alienate that land, we've only been granted one of those rights. We've never been granted the right to exclude anybody under the law. We've only been granted the right to sell our land or to alienate it to the settler state. So that really debunks this idea that we were owners and that somehow we're going to like go out and like do to white people what their ancestors did to us or whatever. That also is a kind of recursive or a repressive idea of like this idea of white genocide or the Great Replacement, like as if like, you know, Native people, you know, but it's an implicit acknowledgement that genocide happened, right? And that these property regimes actually uphold the genocidal orders. So that actually works in our favor to say like, yeah, well, you're admitting that genocide took place or is taking place and that your property system is based on it. So we got that one down.
Yeah.
The second one is this idea of political governance. And I think one of my friends and colleagues, Emily Riddle, she's a grad student. She's a Métis grad student from up north. She talked about how within the kind of pantheon of indigenous nations that occupy or that live on the prairies or live with that particular landscape that I'm a part of, that it was their negotiated existence with each other that made them sovereign. It wasn't an exclusion, right? And that sovereignty accounted for people who, you know, who were considered like new arrivals or sometimes even settlers themselves. But it was like, we have to, you know, like that diversity is our strength. It's not a weakness, as it is that plurality, I would say, that plurality of ways of life was a strength for them, not a weakness as it's kind of portrayed within this current system. And you can look to examples, like there's real examples of this, like Bolivia has a plurinational model constitution that acknowledges the 32 different indigenous peoples that live there, and you know, makes space and you know, it's not like a perfect system because it's, you know, you have to negotiate those kind of differences, but nonetheless there are things out there that show that these things are possible and that you can create a system of governance that accounts for this diversity versus trying to, you know, I would say that the settler model is the one that, you know, it seeks to replace, it just seeks to destroy to replace specifically. And decolonization, if it's going to happen, isn't just about decolonizing your English department or whatever that means, or like hiring a couple of Native people or getting a couple of Native people into Congress. Decolonization does mean land back. And it also means that it also understands that decolonization isn't an indigenous problem, it's everybody's problem. That includes non-indigenous people. Settler colonialism is primarily about the dispossession of indigenous people for land, but it's not only about indigenous people, right? And so that's something that I always encourage people to think about, especially people who have been indoctrinated and who have internalized like white supremacist ideology. That itself is a structure. It's not just some kind of individually held belief, because the first goal of that ideology is to make white people behave a certain way, and also to make other people behave a certain way. So it's incumbent upon them to join us in that particular struggle. And one last example is the state I'm from, South Dakota, has, I think, the highest rates of death, almost, I think, in some of the highest rates of death in the world. I don't know where it stands, like the actual numbers, like percentage-wise, but the COVID deaths have been so out of control, and it's so fascinating to see because the more people who are dying are actually white people, older white people, and so white supremacy actually kills white people too. You know, this idea that you're somehow immune to COVID-19 if you don't believe in it, it's actually killing white people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was really, really well said. And yeah, just in general, like colonialism and capitalism have always been so completely interlinked, right? Like colonialism fed, you know, the beginning of capitalism, same with slavery and everything. And then it continues to do so, like neocolonialism and imperialism obviously feeds this capitalist beast. So I just feel like, I don't know, we can't fight colonial capitalism with more colonialism, right? It's just, you can't fight capitalism with more capitalism. So in your book, Our History is the Future, you also talk about Indigenous resistance as really about kind of a battle between two different value systems and really, the meaning of land itself. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the importance of this kind of worldview shift to create any kind of like sustainable post-capitalist future.
Yeah, I think, I was in this conversation with somebody yesterday where we were talking about oil jobs in New Mexico, because there's this fear, and I don't know, like I have mixed feelings on it. There's this fear that we can't get widespread support around climate justice policy or any kind of green transition, or even like any transition towards away from capitalism, because these oil workers are going to lose their jobs. And my counter to that would be to say, well, like, it's fascinating, even though my reservation, it's a small reservation, has been really hard hit by COVID-19. In some ways, it's actually been beneficial to us, because through the CARES Act, which was not a small amount of money, we were able to employ 100 people. And that employment of 100 people, giving them jobs to set up health checkpoints and to make sure that people are getting food and have access to medications and healthcare, has actually created a different sense in our community of like service. And you see people who aren't. There's a psychological difference that's intangible, right? And this was with a small amount of money that we were able to employ just 100 people, but there's a noticeable difference, because unemployment is high, right? And so when people are like, oh, we're going to lose all these oil jobs, it's like, bro, like, we've suffered from unemployment like forever, for like over a century. Like, don't talk to me about like losing jobs. But also it suggests that, I would say that, like, creating like what Standing Rock did, and when it talked about the meaning of land, it wasn't just this kind of particular Indigenous identity where we just have this like superior local knowledge. I mean, it is superior in some ways, but not in a chauvinistic way, that we had this like superior knowledge of this place and land that just nobody had access to, right? The opposite actually happened. They were like, actually, we need people. We need water protectors to come here. A water protector isn't, it's based on this kind of Indigenous knowledge system of protecting and caretaking the land, but like not every water protector was an Indigenous person, right? And I would say that, like, if we're thinking about the meaning of land, and we think of stewardship and caretaking as central to not just Indigenous people's connection to that land and the meaning of that land, but actually a livelihood that's attached to a real material kind of basis. Like, everyone needs clean drinking water. Everyone needs like healthy land and an environment to live. It's not this exclusive Indigenous thing where we're just enjoying like all the pristine environment. It's like, oh, we actually have a larger like concern about other people. And that goes back to the COVID-19 stuff. The tribes, they weren't just like, oh, we're going to protect our own. They were like, we're doing this because we don't want to spread the virus to white communities as well. Your government isn't taking care of this.
Yeah.
And so like there's a universal application to this. And so when we talk about the meaning of land and caretaking land, it's not just an Indigenous issue, but also, there's Indigenous people out there who are already doing these green jobs that we're so worried about. They're not getting paid for it. And they're not talking about like, oh, we're going to lose our economy. But at the same time, those jobs that they're doing, defending land and water, we should think about them as a labor struggle, because we need that. That's our livelihood as Indigenous people. That's our land base. We need that to survive, just as your job is your livelihood, right? And so when we put up a picket line and a blockade, we're asking other workers to stand with us and to join us on that picket line. And if you don't want to be a scab, right? So don't find a scab.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, just to the losing oil jobs, I mean, they're going to be lost through mechanization anyway, right? So yeah, we're all going to lose our jobs through like automation. These jobs are already going away. But yeah, I think that's really like apt. And there's obviously so many benefits for settlers. I mean, not that we should be in solidarity with land back or decolonization because it would benefit settlers. But, obviously, yeah, there is a lot of benefits because, if we actually uphold the treaties, then that's just a better environment for all of us to live in, right? And that's just actually, working towards better relationships between people and the environment, and working to address climate change and all the rest, right? So I think people don't really think about that. So I just wanted to ask a few questions about kind of this idea of revolution. I spoke to the Indigenous Anarchist Federation about this, about kind of, I guess, the idea that we could have a settler. Oh, okay, Nick dropped off, so let's just wait till he comes back. What's up in the chat? Are people doing all right? Have the Nazis left? Okay, Nick is back.
Right. I don't know what happened.
That's okay. I wanted to ask about this idea of revolution. And I guess this kind of, again, speaks to kind of the importance of connecting the decolonial and anti-capitalist struggle. But do you see a settler revolution that could maintain colonial power structures? And how do we avoid something like that?
I don't know if it would be a revolution, though. Yeah. it would just be like a state of reaction, which it would be a counter-revolution. I think. Right. Gerald Horne was very. He's a historian who said this. The signing of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution was actually a counter-revolution. It looked specifically to the fact that the British Empire was moving towards abolition, and that the American settlers wanted to maintain the system of plantation slavery, which is incredibly profitable for them at that time. So they decided to preempt the abolition movement and to declare independence to maintain the system of slavery. I would add on to that in the eastern kind of hinterlands or the western hinterlands of the American colonies, the indigenous nations were beginning to form larger diplomatic and political structures that were antagonistic to the American settler project as well. And so I think it was also to preempt the formation of a larger indigenous political bloc that actually posed a legitimate challenge to the U.S. empire, but I think, or the burgeoning American empire. But to your point about what there's this kind of I think there's there's an oversimplification sometimes between settler and indigenous, or a settler native binary, because I would say that that discounts a lot of the broad experience of the kinds of people who were brought to these lands, often not by choice, often through war, enslavement, capture, fleeing economic situations that were part of structural reform programs that the United States helped implement. And I think that indigenous, there's a tendency to say indigenous, there's this program for indigenous struggle and we all have to adhere to it. But I would say that looking at the history of indigenous movements and internationalism, in fact, it's quite, the opposite, that they were these very broad and robust visions that looked to other parts of the world. It's important to remember that the most advanced climate justice policy and movements that we have today, the rights of nature movement, actually came from the global South, right? The food sovereignty movement, it wasn't a bunch of nonprofits, in the global North, coming up with this. It was mainly peasant and indigenous communities in the global South who were talking about, we're the producers of this. We should have to, we should have the say of how this food is used, and to prevent its, exploitation. And so I think there's a tendency within the first world, it's a lot of emphasis on what our domestic, policy, and how if we work all these things out, then it's just going to be beneficial to everyone else, without really realizing that the United States isn't only a stain on this land, but it's also a stain on the planet. And that it's our obligation to not only listen to what other people in the global South have to say, especially with their relationships with the United States, but to understand that also has to structure whatever kind of system that we want on this land. And it can't be just this kind of exclusive, and this is me kind of pushing the other direction. It can't just be this kind of exclusive identitarian project, because being indigenous doesn't make you an anarchist or a socialist or a leftist or an environmentalist. We have to move beyond that, because we already have indigenous people in Congress, half of whom are Republicans, all of whom are, pro-war. Like, that's not progress. Like, indigenousness as an identity is not necessarily revolutionary, but indigeneity as a project, as a political project, tends to be. And we see the successes of that, not so much in the US in creating like a large scale kind of political form of governance that accounts for all the kind of plurality that we have, but definitely, like I said, in like places like Bolivia and elsewhere, where they're actually practicing socialism. And there is an antagonism and a hostility of the global North, even amongst indigenous people, towards those movements, because they've internalized that imperialist kind of framework of the US that like what we think and do matters to the rest of the world. And in reality, it doesn't really. And we actually, if we are trying to really connect on a universal level, we need to actually listen to like what they've done. And we have a lot to learn from them.
For sure. Yeah. Shout out to Bolivia. I think that's probably one of the first times that a country has overturned a US-backed coup through elections. So that's amazing. But I guess kind of speaking to that, I was wondering your thoughts on, you kind of mentioned, kind of like third worldism kind of ideas. Jay Sakai wrote about how in the imperial core, the white working class isn't going to be really the revolutionary agents, because more often than not, they're invested in the settler state, or like, as you said, just kind of a lot of people do internalize, even people who like think of themselves as leftists kind of do internalize this kind of imperialist mindset. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. I'll just say that like, you can't just conflate an identity with a class position. And I think it's important to understand that even within indigenous communities, there's class hierarchy, right? And I think race is, oftentimes an expression of class, because class is fundamentally about power, right? And I would say that there is a larger structural kind of like settler, kind of political, like, there is an identitarian element to it, but I think on a legal and political structure, it's kind of like embedded itself to a point where it's seen as the only alternative to things, where it's like we just have to go through these normative political processes to achieve what we want. And we see how that there's certain dividends, right, that are paid out to certain, like the so-called white working class. But like, I'm not on the kind of the bandwagon to say that like working class is solely white. Yeah. There's a lot of white people in the working class, but also they're not the working class at the same time. They're not the, like, the italics working class, and that we actually, to have a real program of struggle in this country, it's not something that just has to be like palatable to like, white fears or whatever, but it has to actually engage that certain contradiction that there are, there are people who they think they benefit from the project, but they don't. And I recommend everyone to read Du Bois' Great Reconstruction, or the Black Reconstruction, because it's that book that taught me that, he uses, I think people have called it the wages of whiteness. He calls it the psychological wage of whiteness. This idea that whiteness like flattens out class identity, and that, the clerk at Walmart has the same kind of political interests as Donald Trump. And we know how big of a fallacy that is, right? But at the same time, when people say, like, when they place an overemphasis on whiteness in the attempts to decenter it, they're actually centering it again. And so, like, I always caution people against that. It's like, we have to address it. White supremacy is a real thing that needs to be addressed, but it doesn't help if you're always constantly centering whiteness as itself as the problem, right? So there's a big difference between whiteness and white supremacy. And it does inform a class structure in this country, and it does have real material, things. And there's some people who want to remove, the class, the relations of power from white supremacy itself. And, I think it's like racial capitalism, as a lot of people in the Black radical tradition have eloquently stated. that you can't separate the two, because the class structure is fundamentally about an expression of race, right? Because race is fundamentally about power. So I have a lot to say about that, but it bothers me because you see it coming from both sides. You see like the anti-wokeness, where it's like, oh well, this is why the corporate Democrats, are so cynical, is they just think that they can, handpick, the representational class of political elites from each of these oppressed groups, and then call it gravy. And then the other side of it is saying like, well, like all white people, have inherent racism or whatever it is, and I would say that like if your lived experience, like, if you grew up like in a place that I grew up, like white supremacy, that might actually seem like, yeah, a lot of white people are racist and they harbor these views, and like they probably have private conversations that we don't know about. I don't know. And, like, so I would say that there's a truth to that, but at the same time, like, that's a very cynical way of going about things. And I guess like as somebody who's a socialist and believes in like a universal humanity, I think that we can move beyond that, but it's only going to happen through struggle. It's not going to just be like, I'm not going to just like lecture at white people about how racist they are. It's like they know how racist they are,
Yeah, no, I think that was really beautifully said. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, there's a few minutes left. I do have more questions. I haven't really been seeing many questions from the chat. So if anyone has any questions, say them now. Otherwise I'm just going to ask my own questions. So I guess I just wanted to talk a bit more about like this idea of land back. I was listening to a podcast called Give the Land Back ? From Flash Forward. And they had Indigenous scholars talking about how there's actually all of this federal land in the US, like I think upwards of 30% of the land might be like federally owned land that they could be giving back to the tribes right now, not even touching the areas that are highly populated or settled or whatever, including the Black Hills. And so I think that's something that people don't really think about. Like they hear land back and then they hear like, oh, well, am I going to be deported, or like I didn't take the land, or you know what I mean? Like things like that. But I don't think people maybe realize that there's actually so much that can be done right now, right?
Yeah, I think that's something that's been proposed. Like in the 80s, like there was the Bradley bill, that basketball player, I think he was from New Jersey, he became a senator, I can't remember the exact, but he proposed giving or returning federal land in the Black Hills back to the Lakota people. It didn't materialize to anything for a variety of reasons. But then next came to like, there was this idea of like the Buffalo Commons, that, you could take large swaths of the Great Plains and return the federal land back to tribes for management and all those kinds of things. And then, that was like under Reagan, so it didn't really play out well. But, the question of like, I think it is like a viable alternative, because a lot of times Indigenous people are already entering into these kind of engagements with like the National Park Service, National Forest Service for co-management. And, like that's good, I guess. I think a lot of people would find that really, like amenable, even like white folks as well. But the problem with that is that it doesn't address the class issue. Like public lands were created as like to benefit a quote unquote like public, which we know as like a white settler public. But also, private land ownership in this country is really fascinating. If you look at the largest landowners, most of them are white men. Most of them are like white billionaires. Like Ted Turner owns 200,000 acres of my treaty territory. He's one of the largest landowners in the entire world, right? So land is about class power in this country. Right. And if we're not addressing that, like the fact that one individual can own more land than entire nations of people, right? You again, like the average like non-native person who's just like living in a city, who's a renter, you're not an owner. Like you have nothing in common with Ted Turner. You have everything to gain by his expropriation.
Exactly.
So I think the land back conversation needs to move towards looking at the the privatization of land and the accumulation and hoarding of land.
Yeah, because it is unfortunate, because for a lot of different nations, unfortunately, like a common way that they can get their land back is if they raise lots of money and buy it back, or they get NGOs or whatever to donate money and then buy land back and then kind of hold it in trust or whatever, which again, like as you were talking about before, that's goes along with kind of the colonial capitalist vision of private property and land, and not kind of a great alternative. Okay, there's one question here. In the case of the Mapuche here in Chile and Argentina and Rapa Nui, how to reconcile the different views of autonomy and independence amongst groups? I'm not sure if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, this isn't like a one size fits all approach to everything. Like with the Mapuche, it's like there's a strong kind of I would say like anarchist tendency among a lot of the Mapuche resistors, because the Chilean state and the Argentinian state like literally bisect their territory, right? So it's actually the problem of those states that interfere with the self-determination and autonomy of the Mapuche people. But it should be the priority of how that's decided should be up to them, right? Because they're the ones who are taking care of that land. And the confrontations that they're having in Chile and Argentina are not necessarily, I mean, they are with the state. There is a lot of state violence, but it's in defense of these logging corporations, these lumber operations, these mining operations, and these large, altiplanos, these large plantations that are antagonistic to indigenous rights. Because again, it gets down to the class element. It's like the security forces and the police in both of these states are meant to uphold a certain form of class rule, right? And Mapuche people are at the bottom of that. But I would say that, I mean, there's a lot to get into those kinds of politics, but at the end of the day, it's up to them to decide what, they need to be granted or given the space to develop what autonomy means to them and self-define what that kind of governance structure is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few other questions. Yeah, that was addressed earlier. Someone asked, what do you think of Russell Means and his approach to supporting Indian sovereignty?
I don't know. That's a big question. I mean, I talked quite extensively about it on a Red Left podcast episode. I would say there's two like phases of Russell Means. There was one that was very much aligned with the politics of the American Indian movement and the internationalism that it espoused, thinking about indigenous nations as like akin to third world decolonization projects. And his views changed on that over time, and he didn't hold those. He became a libertarian later on in his life. So which one? I guess which version you want to talk about?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I'm conscious of your time. I think we can end it there. But thank you so much. Oh wait, there's another one. Do you have to go right now?
No, I don't know. I can take. I'll take two more questions.
Okay. All right. So this one, I'll put it up on screen. What do you disagree with as far as Jay Sakai? Sakai wrote Settlers in response to the mistreatment of his Black comrades within the Black liberation struggle.
I don't know if I have like a fully formed like disagreement with Sakai. I think you should read his book In Conversation with Mike Davis's what was it? Something of the American Dream, Prisoners of the American Dream. I think they talk about the same elements of the same thing from different angles, like the failure of an organized labor in the United States to actually create a workers' party or left party is Mike Davis's thesis, because there's such an investment into the kind of like racial political order of the day. And Sakai's argument is very similar in that regard. But they take a different kind of approach to it, and I think I would say that Sakai is a little bit more heavy-handed, but in some ways it's needed in its critique of like this idea that like we could all unify around this kind of vision of like a universalized like proletarian, class struggle, because the class, the settler class, doesn't see itself as the working class, or sees itself as a working class that's separate from other elements or other kind of variations of the working class. And I think that is an important contribution that they've made to this particular particular debate that I'm sympathetic with, because they were one of the first people to articulate a settler, native and colonized kind of class-based kind of analysis. And oftentimes in mainstream, political organizing, even on the left, it gets watered down. Everyone wants to erase colonialism and the colonial relation, as if that indigenous people just don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like nobody really wants to talk about settler as a social position, and again, you said like it's really reductive how people talk about that in general, but I feel like it's I just think that was well said. Okay. How should we view Anna Aquash in the history of Indigenous resistance in relation to AIM?
I mean, that's a big question, but I'll say that like Anime Aquash was a Mi'kmaq revolutionary, and she was very fundamental to the growth and the proliferation of AIM, especially in like Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and her own community. And there's all there's been books, numerous volumes written on her murder and her assassination. And what I would recommend people do, and to think about the Anime Aquash assassination and those 8 members who were convicted of her murder, is to read this alongside the kind of larger COINTELPRO operation that was meant to discredit, defame, and essentially lead to the assassination of Indigenous revolutionaries. I read a good book called Black Against Empire, where it was for the first time actually. I read some of the stuff on the police repression of the Black Panther Party, but I think it was probably the most comprehensive overview of what had happened, and like how FBI infiltrators introduced elements of torture, snitch jacketing, the kind of paranoia around people being infiltrators. But that at the same time, that's kind of the larger structural surveillance and repression of these social movements from the FBI. But on the other hand, like what we also failed to do is realize like the human part of it, and the fact that like these were people who were coming from the most oppressed and repressed elements of society, trying to make revolution, trying to make change, and they made mistakes, and we shouldn't just like write hagiographies about them, but also we have to understand the conditions in which they were operating, and why they made those decisions, why they made those mistakes, why things turned out the way they did, right? Because the COINTELPRO operation didn't just disappear overnight. It may have ended, but it evolved into a different kind of form of surveillance and repression. And it teaches us a lesson in this moment in time to take serious state repression, but also not to repeat the mistakes of past struggles and past movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know it's still going on. We know very much that they're still watching us and probably infiltrating and on all the rest. But yeah, I think that was really well said. So yeah, just thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I could talk to you forever, but yeah, I guess we'll end it there. I've linked where people can follow you in the description box, but do you want to just shout out quickly before we go where people can find you and your work?
Sure. My major political work, or I guess my major political project, is the Red Nation, and you can follow that at the Red Nation on Twitter or therednation.org online, and we have various Facebook and Instagram accounts for our various chapters throughout Turtle Island, and then also the Red Nation podcast. It's on all the major podcasting things. You can find it on Apple iTunes, Spotify, whatever the other ones are, I don't know. And yeah, I guess the best way to support, I would say, is to look at our land back campaigns that we're supporting right now. There's the Mini Luzaham camp that's providing temporary shelter for our relatives, Lakota relatives who are living on the streets in places like Rapid City. There's already been several exposure deaths. There's also the Shinnecock Sovereignty Camp in the Hamptons that's going on right now. You can that's Warriors of the Sunrise is their Twitter handle, as well as their Instagram handle. And so if you want to donate to those things, I'd recommend donating to them. They need help. They need amplification. Yeah, that's the work that I would support.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll link that below as well. So great. Just thank you. And thank you, everyone. And have a good night.
Yeah, thanks for joining, or thanks for